Will you pray with me? Gracious and holy God, breath of life, crafter of the gray sky and the cool wind, and our time together this morning as we discern your call for each of our own ministries in this world, may your still speaking voice and still moving spirit be present among us. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So our Lenten journey begins with a story that is perhaps familiar to many, if not all of you. Even if the story isn't familiar, you've probably heard the question, who is my neighbor? It's actually a really hard question. This is particularly true with the decline and the palpable breakdown of social ties and expectations. We don't actually like our neighbors. A 2018 Pew Research study that explored urban and rural residents and how they interact with neighbors found that most Americans know some of their neighbors, and that even more Americans never hang out with those same neighbors. Our zoning patterns suggest we don't even really want neighbors. We put these big yards around our front doors and then say, "Welcome to the neighborhood." It's weird, right? I'm guilty of this too. I live in a building with about 400 people. I recognize many of their faces, sure, but I could not tell you any of their names, and they couldn't tell you mine. That too is also a function of how our spaces are designed. My apartment building's layout is almost perfectly designed to limit contact between neighbors. This is true of most apartment buildings being built today. It's actually very weird, but I know my grandfather's neighbors more than I know my own. So if the people around us aren't neighbors, then I guess they're strangers, right? And if that's true, then what exactly is our relationship with them? How do we interact or engage with someone whom we don't really know? That's the context for this ever-present question, who is my neighbor? Now, the context I've offered you this morning is different than that of the lawyer who asked the same question of Jesus. The context in that question was, how do I live forever? It's Jesus who moves us from concern for the afterlife toward concern for the present. He does that a lot, actually. But his response to the lawyer is so clearly tied to the here and now. It would be fun to talk about that this morning, but that's not where we're going. As we've discussed before, when we engage with the biblical story, we often approach it through the lens of whomever is doing the right thing. For our faith, we are almost always the victor, almost always the person who is morally right and good. And so it wouldn't surprise me this morning if you positioned yourself as the Good Samaritan in this story. But what if it were different? Here's a portion of our story again with some slight changes to invite you into the story. I invite you to close your eyes and open your hearts, minds, and imaginations as you receive these words anew. But wanting to vindicate himself, the lawyer asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied with a story about you. You were going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped you, beat you, and took off, leaving you half dead. Now by chance a pastor was going down that road, and when they saw you, they passed by on the other side. So likewise someone else came to the place and saw you, and they too passed by on the other side. But then someone came who you already knew, just from the way they looked, that you did not like them, that they did not agree with you. When that person came upon you and saw you, they were moved with compassion. They went to you and bandaged your wounds, treating them with oil and wine. They put you in their own car, brought you to a hospital, and let people take care of you. Someone who you did not like, who did not agree with you, who you knew that from the outset, that's the person who picked you up and took you in. Who was your neighbor in that version of the story? Who passed you by? And what about the answers to those two questions might surprise you or alter how you think about the folks we encounter in this life? What should it mean for us to share that particular version of this story? See, our Lenten worship theme invites us to find ourselves and our faith in the midst of extremes. In the midst of extremes. I can think of no series more timely and more capable of supporting us through all that is happening in the world right now. The parable of the Good Samaritan is shared in the midst of what we sometimes call the major ministry of Jesus. Before Jesus shares this and other messages, he spent 40 days in the wilderness, being tempted with power, control, dominion. Lent is modeled after that particular 40 days. And so it's a bit awkward that our Lenten journey starts with the story of the Good Samaritan, but here we are. And I think it's helpful because I think that this story helps frame a big question for us, not just in this season of Lent, but for the work that we do as people following the way and teachings of Jesus. How might we prepare ourselves for ministry? How does the story of the Good Samaritan and the intentional refocusing of our location within that story prepare us for the work ahead? I know that I've left you with more questions than usual today, but I think they're deeply important for you, for this congregation, and the church at large. I continue to believe that the American church is wandering in the wilderness, but I do not think that we are fully lost. My hope is that we are beginning to find our way in the midst of extremes. There is an emerging theological trend, this is very active on social media right now, where folks are beginning to cast empathy and compassion as a sin. The story of the Good Samaritan shows us clearly that that is not true, but people have to actually say that. The church and the gospel suffer, I think, because we are still not all that prepared for public ministry. We still run away from text and story because we don't like the words or the language used. We would be better served by engaging more fully in helping make known the issues of misunderstanding, misinterpretation, or what really sometimes just is plain bad theology. We've accepted that of all the versions and practices of this faith, somehow the prevailing practice in the United Church of Christ is the one that should be forced to carry a modifier. I am not ashamed of the labels progressive or inclusive, but they do carry real consequences. We've accepted that there are Christians and then progressive Christians. And while that might seem happy and sound good for us to do, the reality is that for most folks who don't understand what that label actually means, what they then think is that there are Christians, and then there are people who are kind of Christian but not really part of the real thing. I don't think that serves us or the gospel very well, because we are almost always in a position of presenting our theology by what it doesn't say rather than what it actually does. And for that and other reasons, I think conservative and progressive are better left to the realm of politics, not faith. Marcus Borg invites us to consider a language that would replace conservative with earlier and progressive with emerging. I'm not sure I'm on board with that either. Because the emerging paradigm of this faith, the one that focuses on life today rather than just life after death, the one that focuses on personal and communal transformation rather than simply following a teaching or instruction because it's what we've always done, that's not emerging. That's not new. It's as old as the public ministry of Christ himself. And that kind of ministry, that kind of faith just happens to be really hard because it requires us to actually do something about the things that are wrong in this world. The openness to that kind of faith, to that kind of transformation, to see a stranger and call them neighbor, to see the person harmed and offer help, or to be the person harmed and accept help from someone who we've been taught and told will never have our backs, that kind of faith is hard. Again, though, the path here isn't new. It was paved by an attorney who thought he could pull one over on Jesus by asking who is my neighbor. And Jesus offers us a story that, if taken seriously enough, if practiced often enough, could change so much about how we view our ministry and our own practice of this faith. That's the good news. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ according to Luke. Jesus ends his lesson with a question. Of all the people who encountered the injured man, who was the neighbor? The neighbor was the one who showed mercy. And then Jesus says, go and do likewise. Go and do likewise. That's a call to ministry. A ministry made possible by personal and communal transformation. You recall that I'm very big on this idea that in the UCC we are all ministers. And some ordained folks might disagree with me about how I view my particular role. I will always boil it down till I get to kiss babies, bless babies, and break bread. Other than that, we can pretty much do the exact same things in this journey of faith and life. And so this sermon is not just for me, but it also really is for you. Because if we leave all the work up to just folks who put on a robe and a stole each Sunday, we might as well just stop. I don't think it's worth it. It's a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of effort, and for what? Because the transformation is not just personal, it's communal, all of us doing this together. I get you, Reverend Liz and I get you for like 55 minutes every single week. The rest of that time is yours. 55 minutes you're in this space, the rest of the time you are out there in the world. It matters how you choose to live this life. It matters how you choose to present the story of who and how you are and how you might like to one day be. It matters, I think deeply, that we take seriously Reverend King's observation that maybe the world would be a better place if instead of thinking about all the people who were battered and bruised, we simply didn't have battered and bruised people. That kind of world is made possible when we take seriously our own responsibility and obligation to also be ministers. That doesn't mean you have to get up and give a sermon. It doesn't mean you have to wash someone's feet, but it does mean you have to think critically and intentionally about the things that matter to you in this faith, and then you have to claim those things. That's not easy, believe me, I know. But it's the hard things that are most often worth doing. So in a world where we're saying that empathy and compassion are sins, and a world where we are saying that there are Christians and then other people who kind of do something kind of Christian, I think it matters that you get up and say, wait, I happen to be Christian too. And my understanding of this faith means this. That doesn't mean you have to go out and fight people on the street. I don't encourage that at all, right? But you do have to fight, I think, in the public sphere. Because the practices of this faith, most of our theologies, it's getting snuffed out. It's being covered up. And it's awkward, it's weird, and it's hard because this theology is from the very beginning. It's not the new one, folks. This faith is not the new version. This reaches back to the past. It speaks through ages, time and time again. The practices that we do here, showing mercy, compassion, grace, extending love, including everyone, an open table, that's not just something we came up with in 2025. This is from Jesus Christ himself millennia ago. And if we take this faith seriously, if we take this idea seriously, then it just happens to mean that we are more active, more committed, more vocal, and more clear about who we are and why it is that of all the things that we could choose to make meaning of this world, we choose the teachings of Christ. That must matter for us. And so my hope is that in this season of Lent, that you will open your hearts, minds, and imaginations to the same kind of transformation that lies at the heart of this story, that it is possible to be offered help by people who don't look and seem like you, and that, too, it's possible to look out at all that's wrong in the world and say, there's something about us that isn't quite on the same page, and yet you are still my neighbor. Yet I can still offer and show mercy, compassion, grace, and offer healing too. May this be the beginning of our Lenten journey, but certainly not the end. Amen.